It has been the most incredible journey in learning about myself when I began my deep dive on trying to understand high masking autism and whether or not that could explain so much of what I've struggled with. And I absolutely do believe that it does, and it has, and it has been just, I don't know, it's been so validating. And so I wanted to share some of these concepts with you in terms of often easily missed autistic traits in women. Now, here's the quick caveat to that. I'm talking about what we are traditionally see in women and girls, and also talking about what's often called the female phenotype of autism. But this really is just a type that anyone can have. But it turns out that this phenotype, because of the ways that girls and women are socialized and expected to behave or engage in the world, that it also tends to be a very common presentation, especially for those girls and women that do not look like the male version of the DSM criteria. What do I mean? I mean that because of the way the DSM criteria for autism looks right now, because it's been normed on a very narrow population of white males and even a certain socioeconomic status of white males, that if a girl or woman fits the more typical presentation of autism, i.e., oh, you don't have empathy, which is not true, you don't make eye contact, you're less verbal. If there is also research shows any kind of intellectual disability or challenge, they are also more likely to be identified as girls on the spectrum. But if there is no intellectual challenge there, and if there are these typical things that are so far part of the female phenotype, and you're autistic, you may have been missed. So this is the first thing. We're going to go through 8 common dynamics. There are so many more. And I just want to say that Mom on the Spectrum, who I love her content, she has some great charts also. And so there's so many more than these. And there's a great video she's done on all of those. But I wanted to pull apart 8 of the big ones. I think that might be a place for you to say, oh, if I relate to these, I'm going to lift up the hood and do some more research on autism, especially on what it might look like in women and girls. But remember, we are still very, very, very far behind in the research. So it really isn't just a research-based thing. You're going to want to read books, look at research, follow autistic creators, go to websites like embraceautism.com, go to autism.org for expert webinars. These are webinars led by researchers in the field of autism on a range of topics, all very helpful. All right, number 1, extremely picky and high maintenance. In other words, you've been perceived as a diva, as you can't handle anything. You're just so sensitive to everything and everyone. Everything has to be a certain way. Now, the caveat also here is that for most of us who have had to mask and have been masking so long, we don't even know what life looks like without masking. We don't necessarily recognize that we're perceived as being so picky, so demanding, so a certain way, but high maintenance, right? Essentially, that quote from Harry Met Sally: "You're the worst kind. You're high maintenance, but you think you're low maintenance," which I have never related to something more back in the day when that came out. But in other words, the way this plays out is your pickiness around your environment, smells, people, food, textures, clothing, sight, lighting, sound, you name it. It's everything kind of looks like that. So that's an important thing to look at. Number 2, stimming. And so I've talked about using the satin part of the blanket with your fingers. It could be hair twirling. It could be repeating phrases, lyrics, shows, rewatching shows, music, songs over and over and over again. It can be internal and external stimming, whether it's rocking, hand flapping, whatever it is. Like I'm saying, most of us are not going to flap our hands, but give us a pen cap to pop or, our hair to twirl back and forth, things like that. I notice I do this a lot, right? My daughter and I were laughing how often I rock back and forth. And so the point is, check out stimming. Everyone stims. Just because you stim doesn't make you autistic, but there's a pattern and a responsiveness to stimming. And stimming can also not just help regulate us, but also be enjoyable. It's not just a crisis kind of response people might think of it as, like, oh, you're so triggered, you're flapping your hands, which obviously can be the case, but it can also be enjoyable for many people in different ways. Number 3, and this connects to all of it, but sensory issues. And so though the pickiness might look like it, you're not really sure what that's about. Number 3 is really about, like I'm saying, is that if you look at your life, and we're talking about going back to childhood, and this is where we start to try to differentiate, although it's very difficult to differentiate trauma for autistic people for so many reasons, because we're more likely to experience trauma, because the little t traumas are often more impactful but not recognized. The bottom line, though, is you have, and it might be more than one category than the other, but like everything has to be a certain way when it comes to, like I was saying, smells or food or lighting or sound. Like I get up, my entire morning, there's not one light that comes on. I light a candle, light the fireplace, I make my coffee in essentially the refrigerator light. I will sit there because I wake up at like 4 or 5 in the morning, thank you menopause, until the light's out. Now it's 6 or 7, depending on the time change. The point is you have had raging sensory issues. It's not just the fact that your socks have to have a certain like lining in them, which can definitely be it, but you will find that across the board, more or less though, like I'm saying, in some categories than others, but still a pretty good depth of sensory issues. Number 4, selective mutism. Now, this is a thing where obviously in childhood, we're learning more and more. If your child is selectively mute, there can be more likely markers heading towards autism. But often this looks like a shutting down and an avoidance. And I've shared that when I get really triggered with them when they were younger, like teenagers, not like when they were little, but more as adult triggers, that when they would be pushing back or, challenging boundaries, in my mind, the first thing I would want to do is all the things my mom had said to me or my dad would come to mind, but I would never want to say those things. And because anger was dangerous, and I think in my nervous system, it's also showing that many autistic people struggle with conflict that I think often gets written up as, oh, you're just avoidant. There can be this shutting down where we literally cannot get the words out. And I thought it was because I didn't want to say what she says or he said, which it was, but I also realized that I literally get to where I cannot get the words out. And that can be perceived as, oh, now you're not going to say anything, like you're punishing me, like silent treatment. But I will say, if you notice that, it's important to look at. Number 5, anxiety. Anxiety, anxiety, anxiety. At this point, I have yet to meet anybody personally, which is a small group, let me be clear, though, that doesn't have a good amount of anxiety in their life who are also autistic in one way or the other. This could be social anxiety, it could be interpersonal anxiety, it could just be anxiety for no reason whatsoever at all of the time. I was just thinking that I think this is probably more trauma response, but also autistic response. Like I'll be so excited to get somewhere, and then as soon as I get there, I can't wait for it to be over and to go home often. It's hard to be present. But also this idea that I feel like I'm always trying to get through everything as fast as possible to get to the next thing, like no matter what it is. The time frame, these years, this stage of life, it's like really difficult to like live in the moment and be present. So anxiety is extremely common, both anxiety and depression for autistic people. And based on the limited nature, for example, of PTSD symptoms and the lack of CPTSD diagnosing criteria opportunities in the US, most autistic people are more likely to identify as to be struggling with anxiety and depression, also very common. Number 6, being rigid in your routine. So rigid around how you do things, the order in which you do things, the way things are organized, the way things play out, how you eat your food, whether your food touches itself, like whatever touches its other pieces of food. Rigidity, period. Often lacking flexibility. There's a system, there's a routine. Repetition can be part of this, although some research shows that autistic women and girls are less likely to engage in the repetitive behaviors we see in the more classic diagnostic criteria. But the idea is rigidity and often repetition. Number 7, a strong sense of injustice. Now, this does not mean that every autistic person is a good person or has, doesn't violate their belief system. But I think you'll notice for a lot of very autistic people who are high masking, this idea of not being able to understand like right or wrong, good or bad, black or white, like it's clear. Why don't you get it? Having a hard time seeing the gray area can be common. Of course, like I'm saying, in and of itself, none of these are autism. And even these alone, even if you relate to all of them, do not make you autistic, but it is definitely worth looking into if you do. And lastly, just a sensitivity to medications, to the environment. It could be the way that your body responds with an overabundance of autoimmune responses. Whatever it is, we know that the combination of adverse childhood events and trauma and something like autism we're still learning about in terms of the adverse experiences of trauma for autistic people can all make you sensitive to everything. So I will say, though, that medication seems to be a very common one, just like easily triggered by medications or reactive. And really quickly, just in another study that was looking at adverse childhood events for autistic people, they found that in addition, and I know I shared this in a video, but in addition to the other adverse events that we all experience, feeling trapped, very common for autistic people, can be traumatic. Traumatic incongruities, where things don't match up the way they're supposed to, which are essentially experiences that stem from inhospitable environments, including sensory experiences, overwhelming transitions and changes, and the chronic stress of needing to predict and decipher social situations. And lastly, social exclusion. So once again, feeling trapped due to emotional or physical restraints in therapeutic environments or schools, the loss of autonomy and decision-making, and loss of opportunity and self-determination, which can be put upon autistic people. Social exclusion, which is really about bullying, social isolation, stigma, alienation, discrimination, and betrayal by those people in an autistic person's life. And like I said, the traumatic incongruities of being in inhospitable environments, having sensory issues and things like that. So the bottom line is that all of these, if you relate to these things, especially most of these in this video, I would highly encourage you to do more research like I'm talking about on the places I mentioned earlier, because the freedom and understanding, not so much a diagnosis, and frankly, you should also research whether or not a diagnosis makes sense for you. If you have high masking autism, you're not going to find a lot of resources. There aren't resources to get, even for, wherever you are, I believe, on the spectrum. So it's not like you're taking money from someone else, but what helps is to understand and validate yourself, to have compassion, to create accommodations for yourself around your triggers, what brings out the best in you. And as I've talked about, I'm going to keep talking about it, which is there's a fine line between honoring that being alone is a healthy, self-regulating day of just taking care of myself, for example, and quieting my nervous system, versus being in depression and really pushing people away. And so there can be something about that, which I do believe that many autistic people who have even therapists, for example, that don't understand autism are going to chalk up a lot of these to only trauma, to avoidant attachment and things like that, which may be the case. But it's also really empowering to understand that certain things are triggering and my nervous system needs a certain way for my environment to be. And I don't want to feel bad about it anymore. I don't need to say yes to things. I need to protect myself more because of my nervous system, because of how my brain works, and to stop feeling bad about it, whether that's who you hang out with in your life, what the environments look like, whatever it is. I think these are important things to understand. And so that is why I wanted to share them with you. So I will link down below too if you want to check out the bigger chart on these dynamics in terms of a couple resources I like to refer to. But remember that we're still in the very early stage of data collection in terms of understanding really the female phenotype and any other phenotype that doesn't look like the DSM. And remember that something like hyperempathy can be part of autism. So it doesn't necessarily mean, according to old stigmatized models, that, oh, you lack empathy, so you're autistic. You might be autistic and lack empathy, and you might be hyperempathic or somewhere in between. So all these are important to look at. That's it. Once again, thanks for being here. Have a beautiful day, and please take good care, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.